Raymond by my name is Evelyn Marsh Whitfield. I am 56 years old. I live, now, finally, in a house that is mine alone, in the Crestwood neighborhood of Birmingham, Alabama. In a city where I was born and raised, and where I built a career as a certified financial planner, before I stepped back to manage my husband's family investments, and what became, quietly, a great deal of my own. My husband was Conrad Whitfield. We were married for 22 years. He died of a heart attack in March of the year I was hospitalized, 6 weeks before the IQ, 4 days before I began showing the first symptoms of what would become the infection. The timing is not incidental. Conrad's family is large, well organized, and had been waiting for something like his death for a long time. Not out of grief. Out of expectation. They expected the estate. They expected me to be manageable. They had 31 days while I was in that hospital to act on those expectations. I had 20 years of planning they did not know about. If you are watching from Birmingham, Montgomery, Mobile, or anywhere in Alabama tonight, drop your city in the comments. I want to know who is with me. And if you have ever been the person that someone else decided was no longer a factor, subscribe, because this story is about what happens when the people who counted you out forgot to count all the way. Before I tell you about the account, before I tell you how my attorney found out what had happened while I was in that ICU, and what the law says about an estate auction conducted while the surviving spouse is medically incapacitated, I need to take you back. Not to the hospital. Not to Conrad's funeral, which I attended in a wheelchair and which his family treated as a handoff ceremony. To the year 2004. To a decision I made in a brokerage office on 2nd Avenue North, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, that no one in the Whitfield family ever knew about. That Tuesday is why I am still here. I married Conrad Whitfield in 2001 at 33 years old, which is old enough to know better about some things, and still young enough to believe the exceptions apply to you. Conrad was 40 at the time. He was handsome in the way of men who have always been told they are handsome, comfortably, without surprise. He came from a Birmingham family that had money the way some families have furniture, inherited, arranged, assumed to be permanent. The Whitfields had real estate in Jefferson County, and interests in 2 small banks, and the collective belief that they were stewards of something important. I came from a family that had worked for everything we had, which is a different education. My father was an electrician. My mother taught elementary school. I put myself through Alabama on academic scholarship, got my CFP certification at 27, built a client book over 6 years that was modest in size and precise in management. I understood money the way you understand something you have had to earn, not abstractly, not as a birthright, but as a thing with weight and consequence, and specific behavior in specific conditions. Conrad liked that about me. His family did not. From the beginning, from the engagement, really, the Whitfield family treated me with the particular courtesy of people who have decided you are temporary. Not rudely. They were never rude. They were gracious and inclusive, and they called me by my first name at family dinners, and they never once treated me as a member of the family in any way that carried actual consequence. I was Conrad's wife. I was not a Whitfield. And in the grammar of that family, those were 2 very different sentences. Conrad's mother, Pauline, was the architecture of this. She was 78 years old when I married Conrad, and she had been managing the family's sense of itself since his father died in 1992. She did not dislike me. She simply did not consider me relevant to the decisions that mattered. When Conrad and I bought the Mountain Brook house, Pauline referred to it as Conrad's house. When we traveled, she asked Conrad where they had gone. When I was in the room, she directed her sentences at her son. I was present but not addressed, the way wallpaper is present. I noticed this early, and I made a decision. I decided not to correct it, not because I accepted it. Because I had grown up watching my father deal with people who had decided he was not in the room, contractors who spoke around him on job sites, clients who called back for his boss, and I had learned from him that the most efficient response to being underestimated is not argument, it is preparation. In 2004, 3 years into the marriage, I opened a private brokerage account with Hayden Capital Management, a boutique firm on 2nd Avenue North that I had known from my CFP years. I funded it with money I had earned and managed before the marriage, money that had never been joint, money that had lived in accounts Conrad knew existed but had not asked about. Because Conrad trusted me with finances the way he trusted his tailor with suits, completely and without examination. The initial deposit was $340,000. I managed it the way I managed everything, carefully, consistently, with the long view that is the only view that actually compounds. Over 20 years, I added to it when I could. My consulting work, which I continued at a reduced level throughout the marriage, 3 clients, billed quarterly, amounts Conrad knew about and characterized as my hobby income. I reinvested dividends. I shifted allocation as markets shifted. I did not take distributions. I did not spend from it. I let it grow. In 2023, the account held $4.3 million. Conrad knew the account existed. He did not know the balance. He was not a detail person with money. That is why he had married a financial planner, and that is why he had, over 22 years, handed me the reins of our financial life more completely than he probably understood. He signed what I brought him. He approved the structures I recommended. He trusted. His family did not know the account existed at all. This was not an accident. Let me tell you about the last 3 years of the marriage, because they are not separate from what happened in that hospital. Conrad's health began to decline in 2020. Not dramatically at first. Fatigue. A few cardiac incidents that were managed. A medication regimen that required attention. I managed it. I attended every appointment. I organized his care with the same precision I applied to a portfolio, which is to say, completely and with full documentation. During this period, the family became more present. Pauline began calling more frequently. Conrad's brother Reginald, who had always maintained a polite distance, started stopping by. His sister Cynthia began asking about the estate, casually. As if the question were natural, as if planning for a man's death while he was still alive were simply responsible foresight. I watched this. I noticed the shape of it. In 2021, I had a quiet conversation with my attorney. A woman named Margaret Osai, who had handled my business affairs since my CFP years. I said, "Margaret, I want to review every document that pertains to my financial interests. And I want to make sure that the structure of my private accounts is correctly documented in the event that something happens to Conrad, and in the event that something happens to me." Margaret spent 2 months reviewing. When she was done, she said, "Evelyn, everything is in order. The Hayden account is correctly titled in your name alone. It is not part of Conrad's estate. It is not subject to probate. It is, in the event of his death, simply yours." I said, "And in the event of mine?" She said, "It goes to your designated beneficiaries, your sister and your niece." I said, "Good." Conrad died on March 14th. 6 weeks later, I was in the ICU. I want to tell you about the hospital, because I think it is important to be honest about what those 31 days were. I was not aware of most of them. Sepsis, when it is severe, is not an experience that takes place in your conscious mind. It takes place in your body, while your mind is somewhere else, somewhere quieter and less anchored, somewhere that does not receive updates about what is happening in the rooms you are not in. I was aware, in pieces, of nurses, and light, and the sound of monitors. I was aware, once, of my sister Adele sitting beside my bed holding my hand and saying something I could not quite hear. I was not aware of the Whitfields. I was not aware that Reginald Whitfield, acting on what he told people was the family's understanding of Conrad's estate intentions, had retained an estate attorney within 10 days of Conrad's death, and had filed a petition in probate court characterizing the Mountain Brook property and its contents as estate assets subject to family distribution. I was not aware that on the 19th day of my hospitalization, a Saturday in April, while I was still in the EQ, a private auction was conducted at the Mountain Brook house, organized by a firm the family had retained, that sold the furniture, the art, the jewelry, and the household contents for a combined total of $847,000. I was not aware, because I was in a hospital bed, and no one called Adele to tell her. No one called my attorney either. Adele found out on day 22, when she drove to the Mountain Brook house to retrieve some of my clothing to bring to the hospital and found the house empty. I want you to understand what empty means in this context. Not cleared out. Not moved. Empty in the way that a house is empty when someone has decided it is no longer yours. Furniture gone, paintings gone, the quilts my mother made folded and taken. The silver I had polished every Thanksgiving for 20 years. The photographs. The photographs. Adele called Margaret from the driveway. Margaret called me, but I was not yet able to receive calls. She left a message with the nursing staff, and then she did what good attorneys do when someone has moved on a client. While that client was medically incapacitated, she began to build the record. I came back to myself, which is the only way I know to describe regaining full consciousness after a severe illness, on day 28. I was still in the hospital. I was weak. My voice was a diminished version of itself. A nurse brought me a phone and I called Adele and she told me, carefully and without all of it at once, what had happened. I listened. I did not cry, which surprised me at the time, and which I understand now. There was no room for grief in that moment, because grief requires a kind of settled ground, and everything was still moving. What I felt instead was a specific, cold alertness. The alertness of someone who has just understood the shape of a situation and is calculating what it requires. I said, "Call Margaret." Adele said, "She already called you. She's been working." I said, "Tell her I am awake." Margaret came to the hospital on day 29. She sat beside my bed with a legal pad and a folder, and she told me everything in the order it had happened. The probate filing, the auction, the total receipts, the family's attorney's position. And then she told me the part she had been waiting to tell me in person. She said, "Evelyn, the Hayden account." I said, "They don't know about it." She said, "No, it is not in Conrad's estate. It is not in the probate filing. It does not appear anywhere in the family's documentation, because Conrad's estate attorney did not know it existed, and the Whitfields did not know it existed, and the only people who knew it existed were you and me, and Hayden Capital, and your designated beneficiaries." She paused. She said, "Evelyn, the current balance is $4.3 million. I looked at the ceiling of my hospital room for a moment. I thought about the Tuesday in 2004 on 2nd Avenue North. The initial deposit. 20 years of patient, consistent, undramatic management. Dividends reinvested. Allocations adjusted. Nothing taken out. I said, "What is our position?" She said, "Strong. The auction of your personal property, the jewelry your mother left you, the items that were yours before the marriage and documented as such, was conducted without your knowledge or consent while you were legally incapacitated. Under Alabama law, a surviving spouse retains specific rights to personal property, and the conduct of that auction raises serious questions about whether proper procedure was followed." She said, "The probate filing itself has problems. Reginald filed as if there were no surviving spouse with legal standing, which is, to put it plainly, incorrect." I said, "He assumed I was going to die." Margaret looked at me steadily. She said, "That appears to be what the timeline suggests." I said, "He was wrong." She said, "Yes, he was." Over the following 6 weeks, 4 of which I spent recovering at Adele's house, 2 of which I spent back in my own apartment, an apartment I had leased in my name 18 months earlier, when I began to understand the direction things were moving, Margaret built the case. The Hayden account was the foundation, legally untouchable, correctly titled, fully documented. $4.3 million that the Whitfield family had walked past, and through, and around for 31 days, without ever knowing it was there. But the auction was the lever. Margaret retained a probate litigator named Howard Tillis, who had 40 years of Jefferson County courtroom experience, and a particular reputation for cases involving surviving spouses whose rights had been circumvented. Howard reviewed the auction timeline, the probate filing, the family's communications, and the documentation of my medical incapacitation during the relevant period. He said, "In his first meeting with me, Mrs. Whitfield, I have seen some things in 40 years of this work. What this family did while you were in that hospital is among the most aggressive I have encountered." I said, "Can we address it?" He said, "We can do considerably more than address it. I want to tell you what I was doing during those recovery weeks, because it is not separate from what came next." I was reading every document Margaret sent, every filing Howard prepared, every communication from the Whitfield family's attorneys. I was not passive in my own case. I could not be. Because I understood the financial architecture of what we were dealing with in a way that even Howard could not. Because I had built it. I knew which accounts were joint and which were not. I knew the history of every marital asset. I knew where the money had come from and where it had gone, year by year, because I had been the one moving it. I also made one phone call that I have not told many people about. I called the auction house, not to threaten, not to negotiate. I called the records department and I asked, politely and professionally, for a complete itemized list of everything that had been sold and the price each item received. The records department sent it within 3 days, which is what happens when you ask professionally and the people on the other end do not know they are helping build a case against their client. The itemized list ran to 4 pages. The quilts my mother had made were listed at $45 for the lot. I looked at that line for a long time. Then I put the list in the folder, and I called Howard. And I said, "I have the auction records." He said, That will be very useful. I said. I thought it might. The legal process took 11 months. I am going to tell you the shape of it, rather than every step. Because 11 months of probate litigation is not a story, it is a procedure, and procedures are not what this is about. What this is about is what the procedure found. Reginald Whitfield's probate filing was challenged on 3 grounds: the exclusion of the surviving spouse from the estate process, the conduct of the auction during a period of documented medical incapacitation, and the mischaracterization of personal property, including premarital items and items gifted to me specifically, as estate assets subject to distribution. The Whitfield family's attorneys were aggressive. They were also working with incomplete information, because they had built their entire position on an estate that did not include the Hayden account, which meant they had valued the wrong total and argued from the wrong foundation. When Howard introduced the Hayden account into the proceedings, not as a contested asset, but as documentation of my financial independence and my capacity to pursue this litigation without the estate resources they had assumed I no longer had, the family's attorneys went quiet in a way that had information in it. They had assumed I was without resources. They had assumed that a woman who had just come out of the ICU, whose house had been emptied, whose jewelry had been auctioned, whose photographs were in someone else's possession, they had assumed she would not have the means or the strength to fight. $4.3 million is considerable means. The mediation was a Thursday in February. I drove myself. I wore a navy suit that I had bought specifically for that day. I sat at the mediation table with Howard on my left and Margaret on my right, and I looked across at Reginald Whitfield and his attorney and his sister Cynthia, and I thought about the Mountain Brook house. About the room-by-room decoration over 14 years. About the quilts, listed at $45 for the lot. I did not say any of that. I let Howard do what Howard does. The settlement was reached in that room before the end of the day. I am not going to give you every number, because some of this is mine to keep. What I will tell you is that the auction proceeds were addressed, including compensation for items the family's attorneys could not contest as personal property. What I will tell you is that the photographs were returned, not all of them, but most of them, which is more than I had when I walked into that room. What I will tell you is that Pauline Whitfield, who was present for part of the mediation in a chair by the door, and who had spent 22 years directing her sentences at her son, rather than at me, looked at me at one point across the table. She did not speak. I did not need her to. What I needed was in the settlement documents. What I needed was my name on a resolution that acknowledged what had been done while I was in that hospital, and what it had cost, and what I was owed for it. Howard shook my hand in the parking lot afterward. He said, "Evelyn, in 40 years of this work, I have never seen a client come to the table as prepared as you were." I said, "I've been preparing since 2004. He looked at me. He laughed, the genuine, startled laugh of a man who has just understood the whole picture. They counted everything. They just didn't count all the way. I want to tell you what it is like to come home to a house that is empty. Not sad empty, not transitional empty. Empty in the way of a house that has been deliberately stripped, where you walk through rooms and you can see the outlines on the wall where the pictures were, the indentations in the carpet where the furniture stood, the particular absence of things that had been present for so long you had stopped seeing them. I walked through that house twice, before I accepted that it was not going to feel like mine again. I bought the Crestwood house 6 months after the mediation. It is smaller than Mountain Brook and it gets better light. I furnished it slowly and with intention, nothing from the auction, nothing replaced in haste, every piece chosen, because I wanted it there. I have a garden in the back that I planted myself this past spring. I have new photographs on the walls. I still think about the quilts. My mother made them over 30 years from fabric she saved from our clothing, a square from my high school graduation dress, a square from the shirt my father wore to my college ceremony. Squares from things that had meaning, and that she had cut and sewn into something that held all of it together. They cannot be replaced. The $45 is not the wound is the irreplaceability. I want to say something true about what this experience taught me, because I did not go through 11 months of probate litigation to come out the other side with nothing learned. What I learned is that the thing that protected me was not the settlement. It was not Howard. It was not even Margaret, though she was essential. It was the Tuesday in 2004. It was the decision, made quietly and without announcement, to keep something that was mine, in a place that only I controlled. Not because I knew what was coming, not because I was planning against Conrad or his family, But because I had grown up watching my father be overlooked in rooms, and I had learned that the best protection is not defense, it is presence. A presence that exists on paper, in accounts, in documented structures, whether anyone is paying attention or not. The Whitfield family paid attention to everything they could see. They did not see everything. I am 56 years old. I have $3 million in an account that no one touched, a house with good light, a garden I planted, and photographs on walls that I chose. I am not finished. I was not finished in that ICU bed, and I am not finished now. I am, in fact, just beginning. I want to hear from you tonight. Have you ever had something that was yours? Money, a title, a decision that you kept quietly, in a place that no one else had access to, not because you were hiding it, but because you understood that some things need to belong to you alone?